I am Larry Lim, or Lawrence Alfred Lim.
And I'm Penny Tom Lee.
In the 1800s in Tucson, there was a Fort Lowell, and there has always been a Chinese population in any of these far western towns. My grandfather came from China and opened up a grocery store. At that time, the Chinese community were farmers, and there was water in the Santa Cruz, and they were growing vegetables and supplying vegetables to the military force. Anyway, my grandfather arrived, and I'm not sure how he got here, but he opened up a grocery store there to supply the Chinese community and the rest of the community with groceries and vegetables. That was the original store. And, and then as he prospered, he opened up and he moved over to 4th Avenue and opened up a store there. And I'm not exactly sure what year or however. And that's when my dad arrived as a young man, and he was at that 4th Avenue store as far as I know, and of course that was way before my time. So he had that. I'm not exactly sure what happened to my grandfather on my dad's side. All I know is that they had started the store, and then they had the store on 4th Avenue. Eventually, my dad opened up the store on Park Avenue. Now, at the same time, my grandmother had come as part of a Chinese theatrical group into San Francisco. Yeah. Now, that would be my grandfather. He came to United States through Cuba. Now, how he got to Cuba, I have no idea. And then came into the United States, and this was prior to the Civil War. At the Civil War, apparently, if you were a non-citizen, if you joined the Union Army, you were granted citizenship. So that's what he did. He joined the Union Army and went through all the war and all of that, and apparently was wounded at one time. And that's hearsay. And I know that he was in the Union Army, and he wound up coming to San Francisco. At the same time, my grandmother was she was a teenager. She was part of a Chinese theatrical group that came to San Francisco Chinatown to perform or whatever they did. Anyway, he had, by that time it was the end of the Civil War, and he somehow wound up in San Francisco, where he met my grandmother. She was a teenager and he was quite a few years older. They got together somehow and wound up hopefully they got married. Then he decided he wanted to go to Mexico to look for gold. So by that time they had the first son, which was John. And he took the son down to Mexico and established, I guess, started mining. So she was left in San Francisco, and I think by that time there was a second child. And I'm not sure exactly, but anyway, he and the first son were down there near Guaymas or something and established a place. And so she traveled all the way with his second child. She didn't speak English, didn't speak Spanish, but somehow made her way all the way down to Mexico and joined up with him someplace near Guaymas. So then they established the family home, and that's where all the kids were born. There was, I can't remember how many were born after that, and they all lived down there in Guaymas in Nogales area for many years. Eventually, the whole family migrated to Nogales, and that's where my mom went to school, and then I think she went through high school and all that, and she eventually moved to Tucson and got a job with a wholesale grocery place, working for the grocer. At the same time, that was when my dad had established the grocery store on 4th Avenue. So because she worked for this wholesale grocer and apparently made contact with my dad, who was running this grocery store, they got married. Anyway, that's the story I got. So after that, let's see, they opened the store, and then eventually built the store on Park and 10th. And why it was named Lemieux Market, I have no idea. They were doing pretty good because they were able to buy 13 acres of land in south of Tucson on Irvington Road, and they had a house there. So they were lived in that, and that's where, okay, my brother was born, let's say he was 2 years older than me, so he was born in 1930, and then I was born later in 1932. And so that was our family home on Missiondale Road. At that time, the store was at Park and 10th. We had always lived on Missiondale Road. That's the only home I ever knew. So we never lived anyplace else. In 1950, my dad decided to build the new Missiondale, Irvington Market on Irvington there. That happened after the war. It had to be after the war. And that's when Penny's dad took over the Lemieux Market in 1950 or so. And meantime, my dad and mom were operating the store on Irvington Market on Missiondale, on Irvington. So both my brother and I lived there, and of course we went to we both went to elementary school, Miles, junior high school in Mansfield, Tucson Senior High, and of course obviously both University of Arizona and so forth. But anyway, Penny's dad took over the Lemieux Market and was running it, and we were out there on Irvington Road. I left, finished college at the university in 1954 and got my first job. It was back east, so that's the first time I left town. But at the same time, the Irvington Missiondale store Irvington Market was still active, and my mom was still there. And I think she eventually closed the store. I'm not exactly sure what year it was, but it was probably in the 1960s. So anyway, that's how I arrived in Tucson, or that's how we got there, and that was how Irvington Market was started and so forth.
Penny and Tom Lee. My dad and his family lived in Tucson. He was born in Nogales, Arizona, and then eventually they moved to Tucson. And he went to school in Tucson as a young boy, but then they also had moved to California, and he lived in California for some years. After my mom and dad married, they got married in 1940, lived in California, San Francisco for a while, where my brother and I were born, and then moved to Phoenix, where my mother was originally from. In 1950, Uncle Lim, H.F. Lim, who was Larry's father, asked my dad if he would come and run Lemieux Market in Tucson. And so we moved from Phoenix to Tucson in 1950, and I was about 5 years old at the time. So we lived in the living quarters that were adjoining the store. It was a two-story addition, I guess. I don't know if it was originally part of the store, but the bedrooms were upstairs, and downstairs was a living room, a dining area, a kitchen, and bathroom, and a little laundry area. There was only one bathroom downstairs. So we lived there, and my dad and mom operated the store from 1950 until, I believe, 1955. When I think that's when the store was closed, and my dad eventually opened up another store on South Country Club Road, which was called Bob's Market. But for 5 years, I lived and played in Lemieux Market at 103 North Park Avenue. It was a wonderful experience, a wonderful education. There was my brother Mike and I, and then eventually Marcia was born and Terry was born, so there were 4 kids and my parents living in the little quarters. And then after he opened Bob's Market, and we moved out of the store and lived on 30th Street, and then my youngest sister Shelley was born there. I can remember fun years at the store, and it was such an education because we learned how to cashier, how to really make change. How to greet customers. Customer service was just an inherent part of it. Learned how to keep the shelves straight and dusted, how to price the goods with a stamper, and I loved watching my dad butcher. That was my favorite thing, the meat cutting. I mean, it was a full service grocery store, not just a quick mart. So it was wonderful. It also provided food, a steady source of food for our family, as well as a place for me to play. Yeah, 606 South Central Club Road. And I believe my dad may have closed that store around 1960 or so. That's when the supermarkets were really getting to be big in Tucson, and the little stores just couldn't compete. I don't think any of our parents wanted us to continue operating grocery stores. They wanted us to become professionals and go to college and do what they thought would be something better.
Absolutely.
Store life was a hard life.
That's what happened.
It was a good life, but it was tough.
You know, running those stores and that was tough. You know, you're open 7 days a week and long hours and little pay, and
no vacation.
But it was a good life, actually, because the Chinese community was quite active. You you heard about the Sino-American Club, softball teams, and we would do Armistice Day parade. We would always win the prize for the best float. And it was a great time. The thing is, in those early days, our family had the house out on Missiondale Road behind them in the 13 acres. At that time, all the rest of the families had grocery stores, and typically they all lived behind the store. We were the only family that had a house, and the house was big enough to hold parties. So actually our house really became sort of the social hub for any activities that required party. We would host a lot of the functions. My mom would always provide, like when the softball team came, she would host the softball team for lunches and things like that. But our house became, I would say, pseudo-social center for the Chinese community.
I remember there was a big cement slab outside and with a big built-in barbecue. And that's where we had dances, even when I was a teenager. We did a lot of socializing there. Yeah, they were lucky to have a separate
Yes.
house, a real house. The Chinese community was quite
Yeah,
tight
that's right.
in those days. Because most of the Chinese families had grocery stores, many of them stayed open until 9 o'clock at night. And so social activities happened after 9. And the only time I remember our store closing at all, well, my dad closed on Sundays. And on Sundays, we went to his parents' house for family dinner. Those were great. But other than that, the only holiday the store closed was on New Year's Day, but that wasn't to give us a holiday. That was when we did the annual inventory. So we were working on New Year's Day.
Holiday dinners, Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Oh, gosh.
We'd have in our house at least 20 to 30 people. You would have 2 turkeys, American style or Caucasian style, and a Chinese. So you'd have both a mixture of Caucasian food and Chinese food for Thanksgiving dinner. Besides family, we had quite a few guests, Caucasian friends would come for dinner. Most my grandmother and mom and the rest of the aunties were all fantastic cooks. So the dinners were...
One of my favorite memories at their house is making tamales.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that was
my
the other
goodness.
thing. Because the family grew up in Nogales, they became fantastic Mexican cooks. To this day, like the Dana's makes the green corn tamales and the rest. My mom was the best menudo cook. We would grow up with the best of Mexican food and Chinese food.
His grandfather passed away and grandmother remarried. And my grandfather was the second husband. That's why our family name was Tom. So we are related through our grandmothers. I happened to subsequently marry a Lee, that's why I'm a Lee, but Tom was my maiden name. So my dad was a half-brother and was the only child of that second marriage. His mother was really like a grandmother to me because my grandmother had passed away before I was born, so I never knew her. We went to Grandma's house on Sundays. The story of our grandmother's life is written in the Journal of Arizona History, Yilangan. She was our common grandmother. So the story I heard was that when she went to Mexico to look for her husband, she had 2 daughters at the time. So she went down with not speaking any language except Chinese with these 2 little kids that apparently Li Huang, the grandfather, took the oldest son on the train down to Mexico, and she followed somehow on a boat with the 2 little girls. So she had heard stories from other people who had been back and forth to Mexico about where he might be located. One of my aunts would say she would find him and have another baby, and he would move on to prospecting, and she would find him and then have another baby, and he kept moving and she kept following him and having more kids and eventually coming back north to Nogales, Sonora, which is where my father was born. No, my father was born in Nogales, Arizona, but some were born in Nogales, Sonora. Was your mother was born in Nogales?
Nogales.
Arizona or Sonora?
Sonora had to be.
Okay.
Because
But
they were all born in Mexico.
in Mexico. But my dad was born in Nogales, Arizona, so they had crossed the border by then. And I believe Auntie Teta was born in Arizona.
She may have been, yeah.
They would go back and forth to San Francisco, and that's where she married then my grandfather, whom she had known when she lived in San Francisco before. He had said to her, if you ever come back to San Francisco, I want to marry you. So eventually, after her first husband died and she went back, they got married. We don't know anything about him. My grandfather was named Tom Woon, For some reason, he went back to China without her and without the son. My mother used to say that he had to go to China because the Tong were after him. Now, what I had read is that in those days, you had to pay some kind of price to marry a woman, and he didn't have the money to pay, but they got married anyway, and so the association was after him because he hadn't paid them to marry her. So I don't know if that's true. So my mother says that the aunties, who were my dad's sisters, they became his caregivers and protectors after his mother died. And they were afraid that Tom Woon would kidnap him and take him back to China to be educated. And the sisters didn't want him to go, so they kept him here.